In this video, I'm going to be showing you these two large vivariums. I'll be talking about the plants inside and whether these two tanks have been successful in the 2 years they've been set up. Let's start with this one on the left. As I just mentioned, this tank has been set up for over 2 years. I'm taking the sliding doors off to get a better view inside. I built both of these tanks completely from scratch out of glass. It was much more cost effective to build them from scratch, as this style of vivarium is relatively expensive to buy. This tank is home to my dart frogs. Unfortunately, they're not in the tank at the moment as nighttime temperatures get pretty low inside this room. They're in a temporary heated tank at the moment, but hopefully I should be able to get them back in here soon once the temperatures increase. I used my usual substrate mix for this tank, but the only difference is that it's topped off with a fine layer of aqua soil. I can't quite remember why I did this, but I must have just had some laying around. Nevertheless, it's been doing great and the health of the plants really speaks for itself. Before I dive in and tell you about the plants, let's talk a little bit more about the tank. It measures 50 by 40 by 60. It's a Euro style vivarium that has a vent along the front and another vent on the top. This allows a good flow of air throughout the tank. I also have a small USB fan hooked up that turns on a few times a day. I've only used this budget LED light, but it's done an amazing job at growing the plants. Let's start by talking about the moss. This is Java moss and it's pretty much the only moss I used inside this tank. As you can see, it's done a really good job at carpeting along the wood, and I also have it spread out in different areas around the tank. It is an aquatic species of moss, but as I've said before, if you keep the humidity high, it will have no trouble growing. The hardscape inside this tank is primarily different pieces of bogwood and driftwood. Although you can barely see them at the moment due to the overgrown plants, they come out at different angles and heights to create a natural looking hardscape. Here's a picture of what it looked like right after I set it up. As you can see, it has completely transformed. The background is expanded foam that is covered in cocoa fibre. Now let's move on to the plants. I won't cover every single species as I'll be here all day, but I'll do my best to cover most. Let's start with this Pilea. I only planted a single small cutting and it's grown like crazy. It does have these beautiful detailed deep ridged leaves that I really like the look of, but it is definitely in need of a trim sometime soon. If I ever see any leaves that are dying or on their way out, I pull them off and leave them at the bottom of the tank. They will decompose and be processed by the microfauna, and the nutrients will be recycled inside the tank. This plant here is a shingling climbing plant that is relatively hard to come by. I planted a single small cutting and it's done a great job of climbing up the side of this tank. It has lost a few leaves along the way, but it's still super healthy. This here is a Ficus species that has these dark green narrow leaves. In my opinion, this plant really helps with the jungle look inside this vivarium. Some leaves do have some yellow patches, but this is likely due to excess light as they're right underneath it. I've got a couple different philodendron species inside this tank. They do a good job at climbing and filling out space. When looking behind some plants, you can see that I've got some Ficus quercifolia growing in here as well. Its small miniature leaves really help bring a good sense of detail and interest inside this vivarium. I did originally plant this tank with Ficus pumila, but I decided to pull it out as it's too fast growing. When digging inside the tank a little bit, you can see that I've got some bromeliads in here as well. I did originally have a lot more, but I recently pulled them out as they were just taking up too much space. This large one in the background is a beautiful centerpiece for this tank. At least it is when it's a little less overgrown. This small iridescent leafed plant is known as Begonia lita. Believe it or not, I originally planted it at the bottom of the tank and it's found its way all the way up to the top of the background. One downside to this tank is that it has a small snail problem. They must have got in here through some plants that I introduced. They don't cause too much of a problem at all and mainly eat dead and decaying leaves. This is an aquatic plant known as Hydrocotyle Verticillata. It's grown some extremely long leaves that almost reach to the top of the tank. This begonia grows at the back and it brings some nice interest to what would otherwise be a dark and empty area. The bottom of the tank is covered in leaf litter which is thriving with microfauna. These help keep the vivarium clean and healthy. I recently planted this Muckgravia bronze, which I originally thought was dying, but when taking a closer look you can actually see that it's got some new growth towards the top. Sometimes plants just take a little bit of time to acclimate and adjust to a new environment. You may notice that I've got some misting nozzles at the top of both of these tanks. I used to have both of these tanks set up on a misting system, but I've recently turned it off and just manually spray both tanks once a day. With the misting system set up, it's quite easy to completely forget about the tank and almost come out of touch with it. If you manually water it, you can take that time to check up on its health at least once a day. Now let's move on to the tank on the right. Similar to the other, I built this tank completely from scratch out of glass. It's home to my hourglass tree frog named Grogu. Similar to the dart frogs, he's in temporary housing until this room heats up a little bit. This is once again a Euro-style vivarium with a vent along the front and along the top. It's slightly smaller than the other and measures 45 by 30 by 60. I've been using this Jungle Dawn LED light, which does a good job at growing the plants inside this vivarium. I do have a 5% UVB bulb that shines through the mesh when Grogu's in here. Now let's talk about the moss. I used a few different species inside this tank, but once again they're all aquatic species. I mixed up some Christmas moss, Java moss and weeping moss and spread them out around the tank. They've all done a good job at growing and spreading. Now let's move on to the plants. This is Solanum Ecuador and it's been growing great inside this tank. Its leaves have a nice tone of brown, which I think is a nice unique addition. I have got a number of bromeliads inside this tank and I really like how they look. They really help bring out a deep jungle look. Unlike other plants, these don't pull nutrients through the roots. Instead, they get their nutrients through the pool of water in the middle. Most of them are growing small new plants which are known as pups. They stem off the mother plant and then they can be cut off and removed once they're about a third of the size of the mother plant. They don't need any substrate to grow and you can simply wedge them in on a piece of wood and they will do just great. They're a super easy, low maintenance plant for a tank like this and frogs love them. This plant on the left is a Satin pothos and it's been growing relatively slowly, but it still looks great. One interesting fact about this tank is that it doesn't actually have a substrate. When digging through the leaves you can see that it's simply just a foam drainage layer. The reason I did this for this tank is that I mainly used epiphytes and climbing plants. This means nutrients from the substrate isn't as important. That being said, I won't be doing it again as it's limited the type of plants that I can use. And it has definitely caused some deficiencies which can obviously be seen in this philodendron. Although these deep red leaves look pretty cool, it's not healthy and hasn't been growing very well at all. They should be looking like this. Similar to the other tank, I've got a McGravia centennici that's growing all the way up the back. It's definitely in need of a trim as it's grown all the way to the top and has even begun looping over itself. For the walls and background of this tank, I went with something slightly different. This is cargo fabric. It's supposed to be a good alternative to an expensive growing medium known as Hygrolon. I haven't found that this has worked the best as it dries out relatively quickly and doesn't exactly look very natural. If I was to do it again, I would use tree fern panels instead. The hardscape in here is a mix of spiderwood and driftwood which I attached with spray foam. I then painted the exposed foam with a waterproof coating which I added pigments to resemble natural looking rocks. This small leafed plant here is Hydrocotyle and it's been growing like crazy. This is where I pull it out and use for different projects. I've also got some other miniature leaf plants such as this Peperomia Emarginella and these baby tears growing as well. Their small leaves really help bring a nice sense of detail inside this vivarium. One of my favourite plants growing in here is this Begonia. It thrives in low light conditions, which is why it's back there in the shadow. It has these beautiful iridescent leaves which are extremely unique and bring some nice diversity inside the tank. Overall, I'm extremely happy with the health of both of these tanks. However, I am considering redoing them. They have both fulfilled the vision I had for them, and I feel my terrarium making skills have definitely improved since I set these up 2 years ago. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in seeing on the channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future builds or uploads, and thank you for watching.